So, welcome to the last lecture in AP Economics. It's a little bit sad for me because this lesson I'm recording, I normally would be actually teaching this lesson in person to all of you, and it's a little sad because I'm not able to do so. More than a little sad. So I miss all of you, my students, and things like that. But I hope that this journey into AP Economics has been rewarding for you. At the very beginning of class, I always say that I hope that school is educational for you and that it helps you reorganize the way that you look at the world and reframe your experiences so you have maybe a more rich and fulfilling life. And so I do hope that our journey in economics has done that for you. If it hasn't, I'm really sorry, but maybe in the next 10 minutes in this foreign exchange lecture, maybe we will be able to achieve that goal. So let's get started. This is really an extension of the foreign exchange lecture that I did not too long ago. This one is actually about how countries can actually manipulate their foreign exchange rates. So when we talked before, we kind of just said that supply and demand dictate foreign exchange, which is true for many countries. But in fact, for many countries as well, they can try to intervene in that market, and they have reasons for intervening. So to notice the first part up here is all about exchange rate systems, and that's because countries can kind of choose: do we want to have a fixed rate, which is what we have over here, or do we want to have a float? And that's what that one is. And then there's some history right here about that. Before I go on, just a quick reminder that none of this appears on the AP 2020 exam, and that even in a regular year, this stuff is going to be really pretty light on an AP macro exam. So that's not to say don't pay attention, but it's also one where spend your time wisely. So countries today, many developed countries use what's called a float, and that's this one in the middle. And this allows the country's currency values to essentially fluctuate with supply and demand, kind of how we've been describing. There's some benefits to that. It avoids something called the trilemma, which I encourage you to go look that up, the trilemma of classical economic theory. And the problem is that if you don't let your currency float, it makes it very difficult for you to use monetary policy effectively, actually. So the other option aside from float, which is what most developed countries use today, like the UK, the US, Japan, the EU, Mexico, developing countries often use this method, the first one listed, called a fixed rate. And in this one, the central bank or the government or both, because often that's the same thing, decide that they're going to fix the value of their currency to another currency. So they might say $2 will always trade for €1. And they would just say that's the nominal exchange rate. That's how much things are going to be. And it would be like the US government saying this, right? The Euro government, the EU, would not necessarily care, or they wouldn't necessarily have an option in this decision that the United States could make. And the purpose of the US government making this decision would be primarily to lower its currency value. And the reason you would want to do that is to encourage exports and to some limited extent to limit imports. You would want to export more, maybe if your country was developing, because you want to grow your industrial base, right? You want to grow manufacturing. And so one way to do it is to keep your currency artificially cheap, right? To keep the price of your currency very low so that the goods that you sell to other countries are artificially cheap. So maybe the US really values the Europeans as a trade partner. And so they would say, our biggest trade partner is European Union. So we're going to make our currency really cheap for Europeans to buy, and then therefore they can buy our goods. Now, how do they do that? This is the how down here. This is the why. And there's basic techniques, and I'm going to draw two graphs off to the side to show you what kind of both of the techniques work like. First one is supply and demand. And so let's just imagine the US dollar, and you have supply and demand for it. And how could we get the price to be lower, right? That's kind of the goal. And there's really two ways that you could make the value of the dollar lower if you're playing in this supply and demand world, right? How could we get the price to go down? Well, we could make the supply bigger of dollars in the Forex market. That would certainly do it. Or we could make the demand lower for dollars, right? That would do it as well. And they're in fact, in our list of three things here, The first two do exactly that. The first one is that your central bank could buy foreign currency and supply more of its own. And so what that does is it supplies more US dollars in exchange for euros, which that would bid the price of euros up as they buy more euros down here, and supplying more US dollars would push the value down. So that one, check, that would work. Step two, the central bank could change interest rates to make other people demand our currency less. And so that's this one. And that basically is saying if interest rates go down, then the demand for assets, right? The demand for assets will decrease. In other words, not a lot of foreigners are going to want to purchase US financial assets if real interest rates are lower. And if they don't demand our financial assets, then we therefore say there's a decrease in demand for US dollars. And so that's this second one, step two. Usually these are all paired with something called capital controls or currency controls. And the goal here is to prevent people from transacting with your currency internationally. And so it basically, you don't want the free market mucking all of this hard work that you've done up. You don't want them equilibrating back again. You want the value of your currency to be lower. So usually you have to do all three of those, and it's really quite difficult. And as I said, it makes it hard to maintain monetary policy if you're constantly changing interest rates in order to affect the demand for your financial assets. So it's not typically used by developed countries. It's more often used by developing countries. So last thing, the very last concept in AP economics is real exchange rates. And this is the idea that what we've been describing so far, 2 US dollars for 1 euro, is what we call nominal exchange rate. Without any other information, what we know from that is just that that's the going rate, but it doesn't account for the prices in Europe or the United States. In other words, 2 US dollars gives you 1 euro, but what about the prices in those economies? Like, what if goods and services are remarkably cheaper in one of those two places? And so even though you're exchanging $2 for a euro, you aren't able to really buy $2 worth of stuff. You're not able to get it. So we have to account for price levels when we do this. And the real exchange rate is actually quite simple. We take the nominal exchange rate, which would be in this case 2 US dollars over 1 euro. So I'm just going to rewrite that down here in a more generic, which would be the nominal exchange rate, nominal Forex rate. And we're going to take that and we're going to multiply it by, here's how we do this, by the domestic price of a good, domestic price divided by the foreign price of a good. And that kind of tells you, so I'm going to extend on that in a second, but to rewrite this, it would be like the price of a good or a basket of goods more often. And the idea here is that it's like the domestic price of it divided by the same goods, but in the foreign price. And then you end up with a real exchange rate that allows you to tell you basically how much the stuff is actually going to cost, how much the basket of goods is going to cost in one country versus another country. This is sometimes done with like one good, like you could say avocados, right? Or you could say Big Macs. And there's a really famous example of it called the Big Mac Index, where The Economist, which is a trade publication, basically does this, and they adjust for currency values using Big Macs, because Big Macs are sold identically around the world. And so it's an easy way where you could say the domestic price of a Big Mac compared to the foreign price of a Big Mac, and then the nominal exchange rate, and you could end up with the real exchange rate with it. And it tells you whether currencies are kind of overvalued or undervalued a little bit in terms of how much they can purchase. So anyways, this stuff is almost never on the AP. I'm going to put almost, because inevitably when a kid said, well, you should never be on there, and then it turns out to be almost never on the AP. But I know that many of you are looking at international trade and finance and things, and so I thought, hey, let me share this with you. It's a way of basically of seeing that trade actually responds to the real exchange rate naturally, because you would care about how many avocados or Big Macs or something you could buy rather than just this nominal exchange rate. So when you see exchange rates, it is often actually already converted into real, but sometimes it's not. Like if you were to just Google search what's the exchange rate of the peso to the US dollar, it's not going to be a real exchange rate. It'll just be the nominal rate, because there are different ways of obviously constructing a real exchange rate depending on what basket you use over here to do the adjustment. All right, so that's that for economics. I don't know what else you want to learn about, but I really wish you all kinds of wonderful adventures and best of luck in your future learning. I'll miss you. Goodbye.